A daring escape from one of 13 Turpin children exposed the Paris house of horrors, where they were held captive and abused.
New details about life inside that home where 13 children were held captive. Their parents are now facing possible life in prison.
Held captive and tortured by their own parents. And tonight, right here for the first time, the images from inside one of the homes where the family once lived and what they reveal.
Tonight, new images of the squalid home the Turpin family left in Texas years ago, showing the stomach-turning interior, walls smeared with human filth, and that slime-rimmed tub. Images like these are part of a mountain of evidence California prosecutors are pouring through, which they say could lead to even more charges against David and Louise Turpin.
What is up, my little crime freaks? Welcome back to a brand new episode of Mostly Crime with Mai. If you are new here, welcome. We are happy to have you here. If you like true crime, paranormal, or dark conspiracy theories, then my friend, you have come to the right place. Now, I do just want to mention that this week's episode is a lot. Just sort of a trigger warning, it does contain themes of sexual violence, child neglect, and child abuse. So if that's something that you're not really ready to hear about or not in the mood to hear about today, then I totally understand. We will catch you in next week's episode, but I just wanted to put that warning out there before we begin. Now, let's jump right into today's episode. Today, we are going to be discussing an absolutely insane case. A story about an environment so tightly controlled and abusive that when the media discovered what these people had been doing to their children and what their children had to endure in order to survive, they dubbed their home the House of Horrors. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we will be discussing the absolutely mind-blowing case of the Turpin family. Now, let's paint the picture. It's a super suburban area, nice houses, decent cars, regular families, pretty safe. It's basically your regular Pleasantville neighborhood where mommy and daddy go to work for their kids. Everybody is living a middle-class life. There in this neighborhood lies Louise and David Turpin. Louise Anna Turpin was born May 24th of 1968. As one of 6 siblings and the daughter of a preacher, Louise's life has had her fair share of tumult and purported trauma. Her sister claims that the house they grew up in was extremely abusive and that Louise's abuse toward her own children originated from their childhood. If ever there was a defense for the behavior that Louise had toward her children, which there isn't, this was it. Louise's home was an absolute nightmare for Louise and her siblings. As little girls, the 2 female siblings and their one other sister were repeatedly molested by their grandfather, and worse so, their own mother Phyllis encouraged it. She would frequently bring Louise and her siblings to their grandparents' home, where their grandfather would abuse them, and then Phyllis would get money in return from him. His name was John Taylor, and Phyllis herself was also molested by him as a child. John was a World War II vet, very active in politics, built houses and car lots, and opened his first Shell gas station in the county. He was a very wealthy, very successful man. So for those from the outside of the community, John appeared to be a successful churchman who had a nice family and was doing well in life. But like the Turpin family, from the inside, the family was fighting their own battles. In 1982, when Louise was only 14, her grandmother, John's wife, walked in on John graping Louise in their living room couch. Their grandmother was appalled and chased John Taylor down the street with a frying pan, ending their relationship and divorcing him immediately. She had had no idea what had been happening between John Taylor and her daughters, so she divorces John and John moves into his own place. The sisters would then be told not to let anyone know, not to mention it to anyone, because it was over and there was no need for anyone outside of the family to be made aware of this. But that's just it. It wasn't really over. Phyllis would end up bringing her own daughters over to her father John's house in the later years, and it was said that he had even abused some of Phyllis's younger cousins as well. Elizabeth, the youngest sister, said that whenever the grandfather would try to initiate any type of physical contact with her, Louise would often step up and take her place instead, trying to protect her younger sister. When John's ex-wife, Louise's grandmother, found out that their daughter had been bringing her own children over from their home for these purposes, she warned them to stop. But of course, Phyllis continued to bring them over because her dad would bring her money. She justified the behavior by saying that she needed the money to feed her children. Now to introduce David. David Turpin was born October of 1961, the youngest of two boys who grew up in a religious home in the Princeton Church of God, located in Princeton, West Virginia. Princeton, West Virginia is a small community with a population of under 7,000 residents, so he was raised in a really small town. His peers described him as nerdy, a fan of Star Trek. He loved cars, dressed very conservatively. He graduated from high school in 1979 and got a scholarship to Virginia Tech for electrical engineering. Louise's family were devout Pentecostal Christians, and it was at their church in the 1980s that Louise met David Turpin. She was barely a teen at the time, David being in his 20s. Shortly after the pair met, the two of them one day convinced the school employees in Princeton, West Virginia to sign her out of school using David's manipulative tactics. David dressed up with a mustache and a cowboy hat in order to make himself appear older and convince the employees that he was authorized to remove Louise from school at the time. This was all a part of their master plan, where David would take Louise out of school, drive him and her down to Texas, where they would then elope and get back home to Virginia before anyone had found out. The parents did end up finding out, and when they noticed that the pair were missing, they had authorities get involved because of the fact that Louise was a minor at the time. Their forcible return was not an effort to prevent their marriage, though, as Louise's parents, Phyllis and Wayne, gave their blessing and allowed Louise to tie the knot. They told her that she could get married since she had already made up her mind, but that she had to do it the proper way. As such, the two were married in West Virginia shortly thereafter, with only immediate family joining them to celebrate. It was said that not many people showed up to the wedding, and that they didn't really support the decision that their parents allowed them to get married, hence why the wedding attendees had small numbers. When Louise's parents, Wayne and Phyllis, died in 2016, Louise didn't even bother to attend the funeral because of her lack of care for their passing. This really spoke to the toxic relationship she had with the pair, and considering what her mom put her through as a child, it's not surprising in the slightest. David and Louise eventually moved themselves to Fort Worth, Texas, and David got a great job lined up, and the two began to live their lives together as one. As for Louise, she never returned to school after that day in grade 10, so that was the furthest she would reach in her education. Now, let's get into their lives in Fort Worth, Texas. Throughout Louise Turpin's years, or decade-long streaks of criminal child abuse, her and her husband's crimes were almost found out several times, which is what makes this case excruciatingly frustrating. You'll start to see as I go on in the story just what I mean by almost caught or having people suspect them of their crimes. David's job paid him very well, and the pair were financially sound and off to a good start in their marriage. Louise would often write home to her sister Elizabeth, expressing how much hatred she had toward their family and their hometown in Princeton, Virginia. She would ramble on about how much hate she had towards them and how well she was doing in her new life in Fort Worth, Texas. David and Louise would eat at very expensive restaurants, they would go to rodeos and spend lots of money, but back home their family wasn't doing so well. However, this didn't faze Louise in the slightest, and she continued to live her life in Texas without any worry for what was happening back home. The couple was in Fort Worth, Texas for about 2 years before they moved to Orange County in California for one of David's job opportunities. Although Louise knew about the problems that her family was having back in West Virginia, she really had no problem bragging about their well-off lifestyle. She would frequently tell them about their many trips to Disneyland, the array of cars they had in the driveway, and pretty much anything else that would help to boost her ego. Louise specifically told her family early on that she wanted 12 children. And at the end of July of 1988, at the age of just 20, she gave birth to her and David's first child. Their first child's name was Jennifer Turpin. That same Christmas, David and Louise paid for Louise's mother and siblings to come to California for a trip. They stayed there for 3 weeks, and David and Louise treated them to lots of eating out, multiple trips to Disneyland and Universal Studios, and the family said that David and Louise's home was really nice, clean, and presentable. And although this seems from the outside to be a lot of nice gestures, this was the couple's way of showing off and making themselves look good, and it really had nothing to do with their desire to make their family happy. The pair stayed in California for 2 years until David relocated back to Fort Worth, Texas, and by this time he was making a 6-figure income, and the pair bought a 4-bedroom, 2-bath home just outside of Fort Worth, Texas. David and Louise again invited their family to visit them, where they footed the bills and started their yearly tradition where the family would come and visit once a year, and the Turpin family would take care of them, pay for their meals, their trips, or anything else that the family needed during their stay. In February of 1992, Louise gave birth to their second child, Joshua David Turpin, and shortly thereafter, the couple filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Now, for the listeners, you're probably thinking, how does this make any sense when the pair was doing really well and bragging about all of the money they had? But if any of you are like me and have worked in finance for many years, then you know that despite how much money people have, they will still rack up as much money as they can on credit cards. They racked up a ton of credit card debt because they were living way beyond their means, and both of them discovered gambling and developed somewhat of a gambling problem. Of course, Louise never mentioned this to any of her family because she was really big on her reputation and didn't want for anyone to be made aware of their struggles as a couple. They even found ways to still pay for their family's annual trips in order not to raise suspicions with anyone. On November 1993, their third child, Jessica Louise Turpin, was born. A little over a year later, their firstborn, Jennifer, began getting teased at school. She would be teased for her poor hygiene and her odd behavior. She was known for being unusually hyperactive, and teachers just thought that she had come from a very poor family, so they didn't really raise any suspicions regarding her hygiene. On December 7th of 1995, Jonathan Wayne Turpin is born. So at this point, we have 4 children in total being born into the family. And about 6 months after he was born, they load up and go to West Virginia to visit their family instead of having any family come to them for their usual get-together. The family shows up to West Virginia dressed in identical clothing to one another and made it their mission to treat their family to lavish meals and trips while they visited in order to keep up the image that they had made for themselves. Louise's family would later go on to say that Louise and David had a perfect life, that from the outside in, it was a type of life that any couple would wish for. While on their trip to West Virginia, Louise's younger sister Elizabeth was in college, and so she asked David and Louise if she could come back with them and spend the summer there. Louise and David said yes, and Louise, alongside her family and Elizabeth, packed up their motorhome and drove back to Fort Worth. While passing through Louisiana, Elizabeth said that David asked her to watch the children while the pair went inside a casino to gamble. She said yes, and it was several hours later when the pair came back and were arguing about Louise's gambling problem. This did initially raise some suspicions with her younger sister Elizabeth, but being as though this was the first she had ever heard of a gambling problem, she just kind of brushed it under the rug. Elizabeth said that she enjoyed spending time with her sister Louise, where they got to do things together. However, she did notice that the kids had to ask permission to go to the washroom and to eat, which was very odd to her. She also never saw any signs of affection between the parents and their children. Elizabeth claimed that the meals that they had at the Turpin family's house were very ritualistic. Louise would call each children one by one and place their meals on the table whilst they waited to come down and take their place. Jennifer, being the oldest, had to look Louise in the eyes, smile, and then wait for Louise to smile back before she was allowed to be seated. Once seated, she had to wait for her permission to eat. When they finished eating, the children would be sent back to their rooms, where Elizabeth said that they were confined for very long periods of time. I don't know if you guys had grandparents who said this, but back in the day, people used to say children are to be seen and not heard, and this family is very much giving that vibe. Elizabeth said that the children were not allowed to have contact with her unless David or Louise were present at the time. Louise said that this was because they did not want Elizabeth's beliefs to rub off on their children. Elizabeth also said that Louise had strict rules with her children when it came to punishment. It was said that Louise would decide what the punishment was and David would carry it out, often being physical abuse. Elizabeth was only 19 years old at the time when she was visiting and didn't really know much about life and was really naive. It was because of this that she never raised any questions to David and Louise about how they were raising their children. However, she did admit to seeing David abuse Louise at one point and had said that the pair really had bad tempers. While Elizabeth was there, she had a summer job, but this came with many rules as well. Louise had to drop her off and pick her up as well, and Elizabeth was strictly informed that she was not allowed to have any friends. She was not allowed to use the phone, tell anyone her address, and if she broke any of the rules, she would have to be removed from the household. So she obeyed. Elizabeth said that as time passed, things in the home became increasingly uncomfortable. For example, Elizabeth would be showering and Louise would pick the lock from the outside. She would then enter the bathroom with David, where they would request that Elizabeth exit the shower only to watch her get out and laugh at her. They would do this as if it was some sick joke. She said she was never touched or anything like that. Just odd incidences like this would occur when she was taking showers, where the pair would just stare at her. At some point down the road, Louise finds out that Elizabeth had a friend at work and was having lunch with this individual. When Louise finds this out, she decides one day to drop Elizabeth off at work and never pick her up. Elizabeth calls to David and Louise's house, but no one answers. She would end up spending the next 3 days sleeping outside until Louise finally answered the phone and allowed her to come back home. Elizabeth said she wasn't interested in going back though. She just wanted her belongings from the home, and Louise wouldn't allow it until Elizabeth threatened to call the police and get them involved, at which point Louise said, "Fine, you can come back and grab your clothing." Now fast forward a little bit to May 21st of 1997 when Joy Donna Turpin is born. Now, fast forward to May 21st of 1977, and Joy Donna Turpin is born. Joy is their 5th child, and while Joy is born, Jennifer, their oldest child, is now in the 2nd grade, and things are starting to get increasingly noticeable at school. Her cleanliness has now become a concern to teachers as she has become an increasingly dirty, smelly, and always wears the exact same outfit day in and day out. There were occasions where Jennifer would touch her private parts in front of the classroom, and teachers had to send her down to the principal's office in order to have her spoken with. Now, this wasn't to be inappropriate or anything on her behalf, but rather because she was itchy and she felt really uncomfortable from not bathing. From there, for whatever reason, no action was taken by the school to investigate further. In June of 1998, Julianne Phyllis Turpin is born into the family. It is incredibly odd as well that the Turpins give her the middle name of Louise's mother, considering the fact that she quite ruined Louise's life and was literally pimping her own daughter out. The following month, the pair would go and take their children to West Virginia to visit the family. This would be the very last time that anyone saw the Turpin family for a very, very long time. As time goes on, the pair is really beginning to develop gambling issues, which is contributing greatly to their financial problems. In spring of 1999, their home is foreclosed and the Turpin family were evicted along with their 6 children. Jennifer, who was in the 3rd grade at the time, stopped going to school entirely, and soon none of their children would ever go to school again, or at all in their case. This was more than likely another tactic to keep their children at arm's reach, uninfluenced by anyone aside from their parents, and to prevent people from noticing all these suspicious things happening with their children due to their negligence and lack of care for them. Now, back in Fort Worth, Texas, the family's home had been sold, and the people who bought their home were not prepared at all for what they were walking into. It is said that the state of the home when they purchased it was absolutely unbelievable. I mean, it was a nightmare. I'm sure you can imagine, based on the state of the children, what exactly their home must have been like, but the new buyer said that the floors were caked with so much filth, and the smell was actually unbearable. It was said that it took them months just to get it back to livable conditions. Now, in 1999, their next child is born into the family, and her name was Janetta Betty Turpin. She is child number 8 at this point. At this time, the pair purchased their new home in Rio Vista, Texas, around the time that Janetta is born, which is about 40 miles south of Fort Worth, Texas, and is a very small town with about 700 residents. How they're purchasing a new home after going bankrupt and having their home foreclosed is a question that still remains in my mind, but they're able to do it somehow. The couple lived there for a duration of about 10 years. Whilst residing on their property, their neighbors did attempt to befriend the Turpins on several occasions, but of course, the couples advised that their children were not allowed to speak with anyone, they weren't allowed to tell anyone their names, nothing to do with their family, and they weren't allowed to go on about their living conditions or really speak to anyone in the neighborhood at all, for any reason. Neighbors would go to their home and knock on their door to try to introduce themselves, Southern hospitality. But given the fact that the children were strictly told to stay inside, no one ever came to the door when the neighbors would come and knock. 2 of the young kids from the neighborhood were playing outside one day when they saw Jennifer, Joshua, and Jessica outside. They took it upon themselves to go and introduce them to the Turpin family, but out of fear probably, the 3 did not respond to the interactions taking place, and the 2 neighborly kids were really creeped out and didn't understand why they wouldn't introduce themselves back. Neighbors said that they never saw the children. They were never outside of the house, and the only time that they might have ever been seen was when Louise would go into town and load up the car with the children. Other than that, no one ever saw or had any interactions with them. Now, during that 10-year time frame, there were only 2 occasions where outside people entered the home. This occurred when a young child from the neighborhood entered the home from the backyard. When the child entered, they saw animals in cages and newspapers spread all over the ground with feces. Neighbors said that based on their interactions, the children seemed very polite and friendly, but that if their mother was around, they did no talking. There were times when children from the neighborhood would come and knock on the Turpins' door in order to get the children to come out and play, but Louise would shut the door in their face and wouldn't allow them to come out. David and Louise were becoming increasingly physical with their children. They were hitting them, slapping them, giving them punishment in other forms which were extremely abusive. They threw their kids around, hit them with belts, and even hit them with metal poles they had from tents. The children were not allowed to bathe above the wrist, and if the parents noticed them bathing above the wrist, then they were tied up and chained for punishment. Louise had claimed that the children were homeschooled and even set up a classroom in the den of their house, but there was very little to no schooling at all that occurred for the children, and Louise with a 10th grade education wasn't exactly fit for being a teacher. Fast forward to November of 2000 and baby number 9 is born, Jordan Turpin. The next summer, their 4-year-old, Joy, was bitten by a dog they had recently gotten. And the day later, David called 911 for medical help because things were not looking too good. It is at this point that it comes as no surprise that the animals that they had recently gotten did not have their rabies shots and were not being taken care of at all. Medical professionals never brought this to anyone's attention though, and they let the family leave without a follow-up of the home and without getting any authorities involved. In 2002, this is when Joanna, baby number 10, is born. In lieu of having their families visit, they would send family photos of the kids, making everything appear from the outside to be perfect. Although most had not seen the kids in 5+ years and had really no way of confirming that they were okay. When the family would receive the photos, they did make mention that the children looked very thin, but Louise said that it was just because David was super lanky and tall and that they got it from their dad. Now, the state of the home and the psychological damage that had been bestowed upon these children was becoming a little bit suspicious to neighbors and people around them, but still no one did anything, and David and Louise continued to abuse and neglect their children, and things just became worse and worse as time went on. In Christmas of 2002, neighbors noticed the parents in the home had purchased bicycles for each of their children and lined them up outside of their house with expensive price tags still on them. These price tags would never be removed, and the children would never actually use these bikes at any time. In fact, it seems that it had all been for a show, or as if it had been to taunt the children. 2 years later, in May of 2004, a brand new double-wide mobile home is purchased by the family for $63,000. The Turpins moved from inside of their house to their backyard where they parked the mobile home. So at this point, they leave everything inside the house, including their animals, and take all of their children and just move into their backyard. Neighbors say that this is the last time they ever saw their children and that they only ever heard them playing at nighttime. Baby number 11, Jolinda, was born in this same year. Shortly after her birth, the grandparents decided to come and visit the family to see the new baby. They stayed for a 5-day visit and didn't mention anything about the state of the home or any worry for the children at this time. It seemed that the Turpins put on a very good show in order to hide the horrors that had really been happening inside of their home. Shortly after, Louise gives birth to their 12th child and finally has the dozen children that she had always dreamed of having. After they moved into their mobile home, David had begun enforcing new rules. David himself actually built cages to imprison his children if they broke any rules inside of the home. And it was only about 7 by 5 feet and was split into 2 in order to house 2 children at a time. There was actually a gap at the bottom where they slid the children's food into, and one day 8-year-old Jonathan discovered that he can lift the bottom of the cage and escape through that gap. It was after this that David then bought a 3x3 metal dog kennel to prevent them from escaping, and that is where they put Jonathan from then on. David and Louise did everything in their power to make their family appear normal to the outside, but on the inside, things were just becoming worse and worse as the years went on. Eventually, Louise discovered Skype. Now, this was a big revolution for her because she was able to contact them and show the children on camera without having them physically come and see the horrible state in which they were living in. Louise eventually started making excuses for their family and stopped calling them altogether. So at this point, she's no longer visiting physically, nor is she making any calls to them. Now, something really odd to mention here is that at the same time they were living in Rio Vista, Texas, David and Louise rent out an apartment in Binbrook, Texas, and they take themselves and their 2 youngest children and they literally move out. They left the remaining 10 children living alone inside the home in Rio Vista. Jennifer and Joshua, the oldest children, were put in charge of the others. David would drop off frozen food here and there for the children that were still living there, and it was said that Louise never visited the home at all. Despite the parents moving out, all of the rules still applied. No friends, no bathing, no talking to anyone. The state of the home had just become increasingly horrific as the parents left. The pets were left with the children, and they would do their business inside of the home, leaving it in even worse conditions than before. It was pretty much like a farm. Joshua and Jennifer had to change diapers, make meals, and lock the children in cages if they broke the rules. They followed all of their parents' guidance because they knew what the punishment would look like if they didn't listen. Jennifer, the eldest, decided one day that she had had enough. She runs across the street and she gets picked up by a neighbor. She doesn't tell them anything about herself. In fact, she doesn't even tell them her name. She just wanted to know how she could obtain a job in order to get money to buy her own place and her own car. The neighbor, being nice, drives her into town, but because Jennifer didn't have any ID, she was unsuccessful in getting what she needed. When Jennifer realized that this was going to be a lot harder than she thought, she called her mother to pick her up, and her mother came and returned her to the home to take care of their younger siblings again. Now, once again, neighbors did not report any of this information to the Hill County Sheriff's Office. In 2008, Louise celebrates her 40th birthday. She speaks with her sister on the phone and told her how she had recently taken up snake handling and witchcraft. Her drinking was out of control, and David decided at this point that they wanted to talk about an open marriage. Louise doesn't take this lightly, and she goes out to transform herself by dyeing her hair and giving herself a whole makeover. Her and David would go to Vegas all the time and leave their kids behind and take off for as long as they wanted without worrying about the status of the children. They would also meet men online, and David would take Louise to meet those men, have schmecks with them, and waited around for her to finish. Louise would film these interactions and she would give them to David afterwards to watch. All the while, the pair is still running up their credit card debt, even though they had filed bankruptcy already. David is purchasing new cars every year. He's gambling their money away, giving no earnings to their children, and they are basically left to fend for themselves. In 2010, just to make matters worse, David loses his job and they receive notice that their second property is now being foreclosed. The pair take their children and their mobile home and pack up, leaving several animals, including dogs, pigs, and other farm animals inside of the house without anything. A few weeks after this, a neighbor goes over to see what's going on because he hears some noise. He opens a door when two small dogs coming out, I believe they were Chihuahuas, and the dogs had only been surviving because they had been eating the diapers that were left on the floor from the children, leaving them behind. The neighbor goes back into his home in complete shock with what he had just seen. Now, the bedrooms were set up like military barracks. There were cages everywhere, there was dirt and feces all over the home, and ropes everywhere tied to the headboards of the bed. All the doors had padlocks on them, and the home was infested with all kinds of animal corpses, and I won't even make mention of some other things they found. The home was once again purchased by new owners for a rental, and the new buyers had to invest thousands and thousands of dollars just to get it back into livable conditions. In June of 2010, 3 months after the foreclosure, the family moves to Southern California to rent a home in Merida. It was a 2,500 square foot home with 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a loft. David was still unemployed at this time, but he was actually receiving $600 a month from mineral rights checks that he was getting from the old property that they had that had been foreclosed. After a while, the government actually caught on that they no longer lived there and couldn't be getting these checks, so they cut them off. David did find a job 6 months later as a computer engineer, and he was making about $140,000 a year. Despite this, the family was in so much debt from living off of their credit cards for so long that they filed for bankruptcy once again. At this time, they owed around $250,000. David, luckily for him, was allowed to keep his Mustang for collateral and had large payments that he was required to make each month in order to keep the vehicle. However, all of his other debts were taken care of. David worked the night shift from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. each day. Neighbors at their new home quickly came on to very strange behaviors that were occurring on the property of the Turpins, specifically in the middle of the night between around 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. Neighbors claimed that the kids would do marching in a military style and just kind of march in circles. And this could be seen from outside the home looking in because their blinds were not closed. One of the neighbors was a gentleman who claimed he only ever saw 2 children outside, and one time he tried to speak with them and they completely just ignored him and ran inside. He and other neighbors thought that maybe the children were disabled or autistic and that their parents were keeping them inside just to protect them. They did notice, however, that every few weeks they would see David and Louise load up the truck with all 13 children in the middle of the night. Louise's family back in West Virginia tried to make plans and come to see the children several times, but they would always make an excuse and basically last minute tell them that it's not going to happen anymore. In July of 2011, David's brother and his wife and their 5 children come to California. The two families decided to visit Disneyland together, and his brother was never made aware of any of the happenings going on inside the household. That same year, David files to open a school where he lists himself as the principal. He did this so that they could homeschool their children and so that everyone would stop questioning about why the children weren't in school. Really, this was just a calculated move to drive attention away from the Turpin family. Due to the fact that they had more than 6 children, annual inspections were made mandatory of the home by a local fire marshal. Despite this, for whatever reason, no inspections were ever carried out. Therefore, no one would ever notice the lack of schooling going on in the house or the state in which these children were living in. In the spring of 2012, Louise's father flies to California to surprise his daughter. He calls her and he tells her he's at the airport as a surprise. It is at this point that she refuses to pick him up and tells him to turn around and go back home. Prior to this, David's family, as I mentioned, had visited a couple of times. They had stayed in the Turpin household, and they said that the family was a model Christian family and that they had no suspicions about anything happening within the household. In September of 2013, David and Louise go to Vegas for a wedding renewal. They had been in Vegas at their 26-year anniversary as well to renew their vows, but this time they decided to take all of their children with them instead of leaving them all behind. Before leaving for Vegas, the Turpins allowed their children to bathe, wash their hair, and get clean for the first time in months. That Thanksgiving, Louise was out of the house and David was staying in the house with their children. One of the daughters, Jordan, said that there was an occasion where her father had called her over when he was sitting on the recliner. He asked her to pull her pants down, to which she obliged, but soon after she was asked to sit on his lap, the mother, Louise, walked into the household. She jumped up and ran away. Jordan said her father made a promise to never tell anyone again about this, and although he didn't try anything again, he often did force kisses on the mouth with his children. In April of 2014, Louise caught her 14-year-old daughter, Janetta, playing with her Barbie doll. Janetta was punished by standing in the corner, and after a couple hours of standing there, she began to feel unwell. She called her sister over to tell her mom that she was sorry and to ask if she could be released from the punishment. Shortly thereafter, Janetta faints and passes out on the bathroom floor where she had been forced to stand for hours. Louise goes in to check on her and finds her covered in blood all over the floor. Louise takes her to the hospital and informs her to tell the medical professionals that she had slipped on the bathroom floor and hurt herself. Janetta had a hairline fracture to her jaw, broken teeth, and she was told that she would have to come back in a few days due to the severity of her injury, but as you probably guessed it, she never returned. At this point in time, the 2 eldest children were beginning to get a little more privileged since they were depending upon them to take care of the entire household. It was around this time that Jennifer was given a smartphone. Despite this, the younger children were still spending about 20 hours a day in their bedroom, and their mom had been increasingly violent with them, and the children were absolutely terrified of Louise. The children were so far removed from their world that they weren't allowed to watch the news. They had no idea what police were, what medicine was. They basically knew one thing, and that was the 4 walls in which they were confined in. One of their eldest, Jonathan, was getting into trouble a lot with his parents, and before they were rescued, Jonathan was actually chained up for weeks and sometimes months at a time. In late 2010, Louise posts a photo of all of their children with their homeschool diplomas in hand. Now, these were fakes that Louise had purchased online. Not only had they not graduated, but they had not been going to school for probably years at this point. It is in this photo that you can tell these children look neglected and extremely thin, as though they are not eating or being taken well care of. Louise had posted these photos in some sort of attempt to get the public's attention. Not in the way that we would hope for, but shockingly because she wanted to have her own reality show with the family. Louise was a huge fan of John and Kate Plus 8, for example, and she wanted her family to be starred on similar types of series where they could have themselves be on TV and become a famous family. She even said that she wanted to be like Kate Plus 8, but a better version. A month after Janetta's bathroom injury, they bought a brand new 4-bedroom home in Paris, California. They somehow purchased this home for $350,000 and moved their family in. They left their rental home in terrible conditions in true Turpin fashion, and the home had to be fumigated before anyone could actually move back in. Louise selected 4 of her favorite children to be the hall monitors of the household, where they were instructed to spy on the other siblings in exchange for gifts. They were the only ones allowed out of the house, and that was really only in the case where Louise would need to get groceries and would need assistance running errands. The hall monitors had to block the kitchen to prevent any children from eating the food without David and Louise's permission, and each of the children's bedrooms had padlocks on each bed. There were 2 sets of bunk beds, and no one was allowed to leave the room without permission. If they were given permission, it was to go to the washroom or to eat, and they weren't even allowed to talk to each other, which resorted into socializing when the parents were not home. Each child was only allowed to eat once a day, and their meal was one of either a PB&J sandwich, a bologna sandwich, or a frozen burrito with chips. Since the children were only allowed to be awake for around 4 or 5 hours a day, the parents just stopped feeding them multiple meals like they had originally done and just decided to go with 1 meal a day. There were better foods around the house, but the parents would not allow their children to eat them. They would even display tasty treats like a fresh apple pie on the kitchen counter, just so that the children could smell it and look at it, but they were absolutely not allowed to eat it. They would not even eat it themselves, actually. They would let it go bad just to taunt their children. Given the fact that the children were not allowed to bathe for a year, their bed sheets were never washed, and you can imagine the state in which their bed is and the conditions in which they're living in, not being able to even bathe and just laying there for 20 hours a day. Joshua was eventually allowed to take classes at a local college where he got straight A's, and he somehow performed very well despite his lack of education. He did 6 full semesters there before meeting a girl who asked him to become his friend. Joshua asked his mother right in front of her if this was okay, to which she said yes. After this, Joshua would never go back to school again. At the age of 47, Louise gave birth to her 13th child, Jana. That same fall, the parents returned to Vegas to again renew their vows for the 3rd time. In early 2016, Jennifer let her sibling Jordan use her cell phone to go online. Jordan is just 15 at the time of this occurrence, and her older brother Joshua catches her in the act, and he reports it to her mother, Louise. Louise goes into a rage about the matter. She choked Jordan, threatening her life, telling her to go to hell. Jordan said her neck was sore for several days after this. She did try to escape after this, but rushed back inside when she saw her mother coming. On Mother's Day of 2017, they were allowed to bathe for the first time in an entire year. They were all dressed alike and had a photo taken of them to post online. After the photo was taken, however, they were asked to go back into the same clothes that they were forced to wear every day. In December of that same year, Joshua gives Jordan his old cell phone because he got a new one. The service on the phone had been disconnected, but Jordan could still access social media to set up accounts using their home Wi-Fi. She began chatting online with a boy in India, telling him about her life, and he encouraged her to alert the authorities right away. On January 7th of 2018, Jordan posts her final video online. 3 days later, Louise tells her half-brother that the family is planning to have a 14th child in order to really sell the idea of this reality show that she wants to have so badly. 7 days later, on January 14th, 2018, one of the children, Jordan, who I was mentioning earlier, managed to escape. She knew at this time that it was 2018, and she knew it was the first month of the year, but she didn't know the names of the months or which day it was. And the only reason that she had actually known it was the first month of the year was because Christmas had passed a few days prior. This was an escape that Jordan had been planning for over 2 years. She called 911 from a disconnected phone with an extraordinary story that her siblings and her had been held captive by her parents for their entire lives. The 17-year-old told police that she was held captive, abused daily, and repeatedly beat and starved alongside her siblings by the only 2 people in the world that she should be able to trust the most, her parents. They asked her for her address, but Jordan didn't know it. She was able to provide them with a zip code, however. She told them that while she was at home, they were tied up all the time. First, it started with regular rope and soon progressed to chains, and eventually those included padlocks on them to ensure that none of the siblings could escape. Jordan tells police that her younger sisters are currently held captive at home, tied up. She tells them that she has a photo for evidence and displays this photo while she's having a conversation with them.
Okay. I just ran away from home.
Okay.
And I live in a family of 15.
Okay.
My 2 little sisters right now are chained up.
They're chained up?
Yes,
Where are they chained up at?
on their bed. Now, mother didn't chain them up just to be mean. Okay. They're chained up because they stole mother's food. But I'm sorry if I talk too much. Okay. I've never talked to anybody out there, so I've never been alone with a person, so this is very hard for me to talk. Okay.
Do your parents know you left your house?
No, they don't.
Do you take any medication?
What's medication?
Medication?
Yeah, what's medication?
Do you take pills?
Oh, I don't think I've ever taken a pill before.
Okay.
Right, I haven't. But
The girl with the strange vocabulary nervously puts on a little hat, a reminder of one of her sisters who's depending on her.
our parents are abusing. They abuse us. But the reason I called and the reason I managed to get out here, this is one of the most scariest things I've ever done. I'm terrified. But I called because my two little sisters, they're chained up right now.
The deputy, a 9-year veteran of the force, is not sure what to make of this 17-year-old girl who looks so much younger. He is ending a graveyard shift, and it's been a hard night.
Robbery calls, assault calls, deputies were shot at.
He responded to the runaway call because he knows how they usually end. You take the kids back home to reconcile with their parents.
I decided to take it, thinking, hey, this might be a good way to end my shift.
And then, on instinct, he asks a question.
Do you have pictures of that?
Yes, I can show you. I actually didn't have it, and then one of my sisters told me I need to get pictures.
You have pictures of your sisters chained up?
Yes, but they're in here. Okay. I don't have proof of everything, but I have proof that my sisters are chained up. So see?
She doesn't seem to know the word
Here,
bruised.
you can look at that. See, those are the places that make it on that. And see how dirty she is? We are so filthy. We don't take baths. We don't.
How did your sisters get like this?
Okay.
Your parents chained them up?
Yes, because they stole food.
Okay.
But they stole it because they were hungry.
Who took this picture?
I did. I took those pictures.
Okay. You make sure to save these, okay?
Okay, I will.
When they see Jordan, they figured she was about 10 years old, but in fact, at this time, she was around the age of 17. This was probably due to the underdevelopment of Jordan due to her captivity. Her sister Jordana escaped with her, but she became really worried and ran back once they were partway through. When police were able to release the children and go into their home, all 13 were extremely malnourished. They were underdeveloped and not well taken care of whatsoever. The Turpin's 29-year-old weighed just 37 kilos, and the 17-year-old had an IQ of a first grader. The police said that when they arrived on the scene, there was an indescribable stench coming from the home. One of their brothers, Joshua, who was 22 at the time, was shackled to a bed when law enforcement arrived. He told police that he was being punished for stealing food. The other two girls had just been unchained because Louise had actually seen law enforcement coming on the property and instructed her other daughter to release them from the chains and throw the chains inside the closet. They had actually been chained up since October of that same year, so it's now January. These chains were wrapped around their wrists and then around the posts. The police had determined that these girls and their siblings had not changed their clothing for at least 7 months' time. Louise told police that she was confused as to why the police were there, but of course the pair were arrested, and they were arrested on 9 counts of torture, 10 counts of child endangerment, and held on a bond of $9 million each. Police led the pair out of the house in handcuffs. The adult siblings were taken to a hospital, and the younger siblings were taken to another separate hospital. The children actually had to be put in their own wings of their hospital with their own bodyguards because of just how much they had endured at this point. The police wanted to make sure they were safe and took 0 chances. Now, here are the findings from the physical examinations done on the children, and before you listen to this, I do want to tell you that it's a lot to hear. So, all but the toddler were about 20 to 50 pounds underweight. All adult siblings had kukasaya, I believe that's how you say it, which is the wasting away of muscle mass. Jennifer, who was 29, and Jessica, who was 28, were not able to have children because of the state of their physical being. Jennifer had malnutrition, acute B12 deficiency, inability to perform mental tasks, and tingling weakness in hands and feet. Joshua was 5'8" and 115 pounds. He had severe iron deficiency and vitamin D deficiency as well. Jonathan, the 22-year-old, had the same issues as his brothers and sisters, plus skeletal abnormalities from the years of being restrained by chains and ropes. He was about 5'7" and 100 pounds, which is about 47 pounds underweight. Janetta was not necessarily underweight, but had shown slow cognition neuropathy, severe malnutrition, iron and vitamin D deficiencies, and more. Jordan, James, and Jalissa were the worst of the youngest. Jalissa's weight percentile was 0.01, and normal should be between 5 on the low end and 85 on the high end. Her height was 0.79 percentile, so these are way below the average of any other children their age. Her mid-upper arm circumference was actually the same size of a 4-month-old. She also had heart and liver damage and psychosocial dwarfism. James, who was 15 at the time, had weighed in the negative 0.1 percentile. His height was 1.4 percentile, and his muscles were so weak that he could barely walk. He had scoliosis, and he exhibited antisocial behavior. He told doctors that he wanted to kill animals and that in his dreams he could predict the future. Jordan, the one who called 911, was just over 94 pounds. She had protein malnutrition, muscle wasting, mild scoliosis, and was very childlike for her age. She needed speech therapy as well because of how difficult it was to understand her. Jolinda, the 13-year-old, had severe malnutrition and muscle wasting. She was also extremely underweight and under height for her age. She had the weight of a 7-year-old at just the age of 13. After just 10 days in the hospital, some of these children were putting on 8 to 10 pounds. That's how much they would be putting on in about a year's time frame, so it's obvious that previous to this, they were not being fed. Doctors couldn't even feed them normal proportions at this time right away because of how long they had been starved for. They were really worried that they would develop a severe eating disorder if they did, so they had to kind of slowly start feeding them more and more as time went on. Doctors were even quoted saying that they would need lifetime support for even a half chance at life because of just how much PTSD they had endured. Police began their investigation by conducting a neighborhood canvass, and because of how secretive they were, the neighbors really couldn't provide much information on the family. In fact, some neighbors were really shocked to find out that they actually had 13 children living in the house because they'd only ever really seen 2 to 3 at a time. When police investigated the property, they noticed hundreds of DVDs and toys that their parents had purchased in the garage. These gifts were just placed in the garage to tease their kids, never to really use them, or they never really allowed them to play with them. Louise had thousands of items of clothing, some still with the tags on them, and yet the children each had one item of clothing, one shirt, one pants, etc. David's parents even went on to hire their own lawyer in order to protect them against these allegations once the investigation commenced. They shut down contact immediately after with the media. Louise's family, on the other hand, did not mind talking at all. They took their stories to Dr. Phil and Dr. Oz, and they expressed their stories to the media and told everyone about the childhood they have growing up alongside their sister Louise and what it was like growing up in a horrible environment. Both of her sisters, Louise's sisters, went on to write books detailing their lives and were surprised about what had been taking place in the Turpin family all this time. The siblings visited their sister and David in jail, and apparently the two were remorseful about what happened. This was most likely them just feeling bad about being caught. David and Louise in Turpin were sentenced in 2019 to 25 years to life in prison after pleading guilty to torture and multiple counts of false imprisonment, cruelty to adult dependents, and willful child cruelty. Prior to their sentencing, each prepared a statement in court. Louise is apologizing for everything I've done to hurt my children, and David said that he was sorry if he's done anything to cause them harm. So in April of 2019, this sentencing occurs, and several of the Turpin children show up, many of them going by Jane Doe in order to protect their identity. Some of them made statements that not only reflected their mind-boggling resiliency, but also a tendency to want to protect David and Louise, a hallmark of long-term abuse. As the story unfolded through their interviews with investigators, some painted a picture of two well-meaning parents forced to make tough choices. Despite the children's love for their parents, after all they had gone through, the adult siblings' attorney, Jack Osborne, told reporters after court that None of his clients objected to their parents' sentencing, saying that they understand there are consequences for their actions. And it is very possible that the conditions in which the Turpins were living could still be as such to this date if Jordan hadn't decided on that night of January 14th, 2018, that she would crawl out of the window, go into the darkness, clutching onto her old cell phone, and try to obtain help. An attorney who represented the couple in a 2011 bankruptcy filing told the LA Times that they seemed like a very normal couple who fell into financial problems and that they spoke very highly of their children. The lives of the Turpin children have been permanently altered, and they will always have a hindered ability to learn, to grow, and to thrive as other children might be able to. Their parents are the reason for their delayed mental, physical, and emotional health, and to the extent that they do thrive, it will not be because of their parents, but it will be in spite of them. And this is something that Judge Bernard Schwartz told David and Louise during their sentencing. After the parents' conviction in 2019, the Turpin siblings were placed into foster care. The sad thing is that their abuse didn't end after the sentencing. While it was for a brief time for the adults in the group, 6 of the children were placed into foster homes. There was alleged abuse caused by their foster families where 5 of the Turpin children were present, and these people were arrested later on. Some of the children now, as you're probably wondering, do live independently. They have their own apartments, they have their own jobs, they're going to school. Some even volunteer to the community or to their churches. But it is really sad that authorities, the government, their neighbors, their parents, everyone in their life failed them. As you can tell, their childhood and teenage years of abuse have been forever ingrained in them. These children were not only victims of abuse then, but are victims of abuse now and for the rest of their lives as they suffer through the severe PTSD that they have. And although justice was technically served and their parents went to jail, it doesn't make up for what these children went through and what they will have to go through for their entire lives. I know these stories are really hard to listen to, but I think it is important to listen to them, and it is important to hear about the stories of these victims, because the more aware we are, the more opportunities there are for us to find out what we can do to help victims in need. So I thank all of my listeners for listening to today's episode. I know it was a long one, and for listening to the stories of these victims. And I hope that this opened some insight for all of you into what victims of abuse might be going through. And maybe it's helped you identify ways to identify people who are going through that kind of thing. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and I thank you so much once again for tuning in, and we will see you next week for another episode of Mostly Crime with Mai.